Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeologists who work in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University, and am joined with by two colleagues, also from La Sierra University, Dr. Larry Geraty, who continues to stay busy, having retired from the presidency of La Sierra, but we keep working on archaeology things, right, including a new museum on campus. Thank you for your work on that, Larry. Dr. Bramlett is an associate professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity and chair of the Department of Biblical Studies and Archaeology in the Divinity School at La Sierra. Should I have put that archaeology and biblical studies in that order, just to show importance, or maybe our colleagues wouldn't appreciate that?
Yeah, we can mix it up once in a while.
Okay. Sure. We have been privileged to walk through the books of the Bible. And now in the New Testament, although there's so much condensed, if you think archaeologically, we're only working with a few decades in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, where we live and where we spend most of our time, we have centuries.
Long stretches.
That's exactly right. And so Roman period, so we're in the Roman period, but now we're dealing with a different kind of book in the New Testament. Martin Luther called the Epistle of James, or the letter of James, an epistle of straw. What do you think about the book of James? Is it come across that way to you, or is there something that has captured your attention?
Even though it's the 500th year of the Reformation and Martin Luther, I would disagree with him. I enjoy James. It has so much practical information, and it's fun, I think, to read, and good counsel.
Yeah. Lots of counsel.
Lots of counsel.
And we're going to come back to that, because people have suggested that James is like the wisdom literature. Not as much like the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, but some that's between the Testaments. There are a couple books between the Testaments. So we'll come back to that. And the reason is this paranesis, this advice, these instructions, these guidelines that come from the book of James. Ken?
I mean, I think at different times in our lives we need to hear different messages, and certainly in different times in history there's different messages which are important. So I can excuse Martin Luther, I suppose, but it doesn't come across like a book emphasizing works only. That's how Martin Luther felt about it. To me, it's very practical. If you believe this way, you know, he doesn't tell you to do certain things so much as it's the virtues of how we interact with others, you know, the pride, the things that are almost internal in our outlooks, which affect how we relate with people. But it's very important in a community to have these virtues, I guess we could call it, which should be the outgrowth of our beliefs.
So I've wondered if Martin Luther, not unlike most people who are strong-willed and focused, that you end up with a Bible within the Bible. I mean, is that a possibility that we might have with Martin Luther?
You know, Luther was so excited about his new insights, and James doesn't have a lot to say about, you know, what exercised Luther at the time. And so I think he was overwhelmed by that and sort of disregarded the importance of the council.
I've also wondered if James, which I think has a Hebraic sort of sense to it, and in other words, somehow Hebrew thought and kind of norms and guidelines and so on.
Doesn't seem to be written for a Jewish audience around the Roman Empire.
I would suggest that's the case. And if that's true, then there's this much more holistic sense. How would you even separate faith from works? And I think James kind of reflects that. I mean, in fact, he basically comes down to say, can you have faith without works? And so that already is, if it is Hebraic, and Paul is very much Greco-Roman, that even culturally they're looking at things differently. And of course, Martin Luther's coming along, and as you say, has discovered something in Paul that's very exciting to him. So I'm not going to call it an epistle of straw.
No,
I think it's much more.
That's good.
Well, before we get to it, we have some artifacts on the table in front of us. A number of varied artifacts. We want to thank Christina Reed, who is the assistant curator of our center and of our labs, for preparing these for us each time. Kent, what do you have in front of you?
I guess we could say earthen artifacts in the sense they're stone and clay. James does talk about differences in social hierarchy, right? The rich and the poor. And here, I guess we have things that would be probably in common for rich and poor in this case. This is an ossuary. It's a bone box. After the flesh decays, the bones would be collected in a box like this, carved out of one piece of limestone, and then would be placed on probably on a ledge in the family tomb.
And the size obviously means it's a child, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
The bone box has to be long enough for the longest bones, the leg bones of the body, and so this is quite small. So it would,
And I think one of the reasons we wanted to bring the ossuary, thank you, Larry, for this gift to the museum and to the center, is that there is so much publicity about another ossuary
Right.
with the name of Yaakov, or the Greek name would be James, and so we'll come to that, but ossuaries are important here.
and then the ceramic vessels here, representative of cooking, eating, drinking. It's fairly small, but it could have had at least some oil or something, some liquids. And then this is everyday life. This is end of life in many regards, but typical of the Roman world.
And a metal ladle used for domestic purposes.
No doubt. Stews were very common, and they would be eaten out of a bowl, perhaps like this.
Right.
Again, a thick soup, a stew, so the ladle would be useful for serving.
One of the things that Christina and I are discovering about Roman taste is that sauces were very important for pretty much any menu, including some sauces that we wouldn't be quite so excited to get into, like the garum, like the fermented fish sauce, but other marinades and so on. And so I suspect that a ladle like this would come in pretty handy
For many
if
uses.
you really like sauces. Larry, what do you have?
Well, continuing the theme of ceramics and pottery, we have a series of lamps here, clay lamps. And you have the hole for the wick here at the extremity, and then in the middle is where you put the oil. This is the most usual one that comes from the time of Jesus, with the kind of flared out nozzle on it. They're called Herodian because they appear in the time of Herod. But these others are also all Roman. This one is particularly interesting because it's got a figure that has been made in the mold, a winged figure, so maybe an angel of some kind. But those would be, of course, very useful in a household when the sun set and you were trying to get your work done. The other things that are here in this area are all things used primarily, I suppose, by ladies because they have to do with grooming and with fixing up your artificial face. You would use the eyeshadow that comes in vessels like that with an applicator. You have a comb and a mirror and bracelets. Here you have a little spoon that would be used primarily, probably also for ointment or something like that. I don't know. So we're looking at things that would be on the dresser when a woman would get up and fix herself up before going out in public.
When I see wooden combs, I think of some of the discoveries at Qumran, wooden combs discovered there. And when they did different kinds of tests on them, lots of lice eggs.
Or on the comb.
The egg shell. I mean, these things are indestructible. And it turns out that probably 50% of the combs at
Had lice.
Qumran. So people were busy scratching.
And when I see the glass bracelets too, I think that you wouldn't do a lot of physical labor wearing glass bracelets.
Right.
You know, they would break. So this is clearly something more aristocratic, or perhaps for special occasions.
And then if we move over further to our audience's left, the two pins here, probably hairpins. There were pins, but typically shorter, to hold outer garments together, fibulae. But these were probably hairpins. And then, of course, a nice necklace of beads. And then we move out of this kind of delicate, petite sort of artifacts here to something very coarse and strong, and that is a horse's bit that would be attached to bridle. But then if we move over further on the table, we would come to a bowl, probably a metal bowl, probably for serving. I don't see how it could be used as a cooking bowl because of the way the handle is. But it's very decorative, it's beautiful, and
made from bronze, huh?
Made from bronze, and so maybe some fish sauce mixed in with something else marinated, using that ladle.
Yeah,
we'll see about how many of these things we can pull together for that. Some really interesting artifacts that we hope illustrate not just the Roman period, but now some things connected with the book that we're talking about.
Because all these things that are pictured here, or that are on the table, are connected in one way or another to the letter that we're talking about.
That's right. That's right. So then let's get a kind of move to the slides and get a better picture of the book itself. Our standard context. Archaeologists work in context. And so we think about geopolitics, we think about the map of the Roman world. We've seen it several times, but it's so much a part of what we do when we talk about these books. And the Pax Romana that we've talked about is partly because of this, isn't it, Ken?
It is, and for 200 years, the Roman peace held, and there were no significant wars within the boundaries of Rome, which had an incredible impact, really, on daily life.
Maybe in some ways on the development of Christianity, or at least the explosive expansion of Christianity. So then let's take a look at the emperors. This slide we show pretty much every time too, and these two represent, Claudius and Nero, represent the emperors during whose time we have the New Testament written. Except, I guess we could say, for John. And then some people would put some of the books past 70 AD. But otherwise, we're talking about most of the New Testament here. Okay, date of writing. When is the Epistle of James written?
There are always debates, aren't there, about dating, but it looks like it's during the time of James, the brother of Jesus. The only other James might be the son of Zebedee, but he dies, according to Acts, before this time probably. So it's probably the brother of Jesus, and that would be the decade of the 40s or 50s.
So some people would put it early. Kent, are there people who argue in another direction?
Well, I was just thinking, I think James is usually, if it's the brother of Jesus, he was executed, about 62 or so? So yeah, anywhere within those last two emperors of the Judeo-Claudian dynasty. I don't know, I'm sure there is a minority that would put him way late. There's usually some outlying theories, but I'm comfortable with this, this period here, somewhere before 62.
And I think that is typically the window, somewhere in the 40s or into the 60s. But you're right, some people would put that, as with all New Testament books, quite a bit later. So, audience, we talked about Hebraic, so probably Jewish Christians.
Certainly to Asia Minor, as well as other places where the Jewish communities were, but yeah.
Well, we will look at the outline and in the process get at some of those major issues too. So, an epistle, we call it a Catholic or global or general epistle or letter because of its appeal more widely.
And that's what Catholic means. It means general. We sometimes forget that's the actual meaning of the word.
Right. So just looking at the outline, it looks like suffering is important to James. This must be suffering of the Jewish Christians, maybe Christians at large. But in any case, suffering. I mean, it's like an inclusio to this book. You have the the introduction and the conclusion, but then suffering comes right next and then just before the end. And in the center is wisdom. A number of people feel that this is a wisdom book, and we'll take a little bit of a look at that in a moment. Like, very quickly, looking here at some of the potential archaeological connections. Wisdom. Wisdom literature, typically when we think about it, it's Old Testament. Job, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, probably some Psalms and some other passages here and there, just because of contents, theme, and overall perspective. There is a sense in which wisdom literature, it's religious, but it's not quite as pious as some.
It's very practical.
It is very practical, and some people have written books entitled Wisdom Literature of the Old Testament, In Man We Trust. And that's probably overstating it, but it captures an audience's attention. In the process, we probably ought to think about, I like the word practical, because
it's based on experience. You know, if you've lived a long life, you know what works and what doesn't.
Observation and experience.
Right.
On all of those. So we do have connections. The connections in James are not so much with the Old Testament, though. Ecclesiasticus, or the wisdom of Ben Sirach, or of Sirach. From about 180 BC, so we're talking 2nd century BC.
A book that we usually relegate to the Apocrypha.
That's right, that's right. And then another book, The Wisdom of Solomon, which comes, most people date to about 30 BC. And so these are the ones that James is closer to. In fact, people have drawn, there are at least a dozen direct, not quite quote, but lots of words similar
allusions
between James and these two intertestamental wisdom books. And then, of course, the whole business of instructions and guidelines and practical help for living would fit within that wisdom category. It certainly fits within the intertestamental wisdom literature. Orphans and widows, we've seen them before, but we're going to look at some other reliefs of them. And then, of course, wealthy and poor. In the Hebrew Bible, there are 4 categories of poor. There are the poor, there are the widows, there are the orphans, and then the aliens, or the migrants. And so those groups are kind of combined in James, just as the poor. And so we'll see something
and all
about
4 of those we still have with us today, don't we?
do.
So the practical wisdom can be helpful to us today.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is not out of date. The
No,
book of James is not out of date, nor the Old Testament concern for social justice either. And then I probably will stop here just a minute and think about these virtues, okay? The bottom of our slides here. The Romans had lots of virtues. You can find lists of them just by going online. You can find lists of vices, too. And a lot of the New Testament literature that we've looked at on this program does some contrasting between these virtues and vices.
Because I think most school children were brought up on these lists, weren't they, of vices and of virtues, so that they would be familiar with this kind of thing.
Right. And according, at least to some authors, there are personal virtues as well as public. And so just let me note a couple of them. I've put on the slide here, especially patience. And patience does show up, but it's not in the personal ones, it's in the public. That ought to kind of help us think about this in ways beyond individuals. But in terms of personal, such interesting virtues as humor, dignity, mercy, industriousness, hard work, dutifulness. That's actually a translation of pietas, which we would normally go with piety, but in Roman virtues, it is doing something. It's not just going to church, it's doing something. Prudentia, prudence, or wisdom, that's in there. Wholesomeness. Okay, so then some of the public virtues. Equity, that is fair dealing. Clemency, or mercy. Concord, comes from the Latin word concordia. So concord, harmony among the Roman people. That's not bad. In fact, a number of people would argue that it is these virtues and then avoidance of the vices that gave to Rome a political stability that allowed a kind of a moral fiber as well as a political fiber to develop in the empire. Okay, a couple more public ones. Spirit of Rome. And it comes from the word that we would pronounce genius. The spirit of Rome, acknowledgement of the combined spirit of Rome and its people. I bring this up because one of the things that James asks his audience to do is to follow the authorities. Don't make the authorities angry at you. Do what the authorities ask of you, if that is conscionable to you.
That's presuming that the authorities have these virtues.
Well, you know, if everybody did, if Roman society, if they did practice, and we assume that everybody's human and so we can't expect everybody to, but that's correct, if we could assume that. Another couple, mirth and rejoicing. Okay, that's a public virtue in Rome. Justice, liberality, endurance, and patience. So I mention that here. I mean, these virtues that James lists and that Paul listed in some of his letters, they're part of Hebrew thought, too, of course. But it's always been interesting to me. I mean, these people are working in the Roman world, so there have to be these resonances. And we find that from the list here. Courage is another one. Modesty and chastity. We hear a lot about that in the New Testament epistles, too.
That's not a... Sorry. I was just saying, we sometimes think that Roman culture had completely different values, that it celebrated dissipation. But no, a lot of the, especially the more reflective Roman authors, were concerned about the breakdown of civil society. And so maybe early Christians could consider themselves better Roman citizens or fulfilling the ideals of much of the Roman citizen standards.
Okay, we pay attention to that. Good.
The comment I was going to make was that our civil government today in the United States could benefit from reviewing this list of virtues.
Should we send the list on?
I was thinking about that, right?
We have a job to do, Larry. That's our next task. Okay. So let's look at some more things here that do have to do with these stratification levels in society. So orphans, donations in the Roman setting to orphans. This coin reflecting on Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian's donation to orphans, represented there. Wealthy school children, we certainly had poor people, but did they ever go to school? I don't know. I have to ask. I'm not an authority on education at this time period.
Certainly had tutors.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
We see here the elder one.
And you see a scroll in his hand. Love this, women's hairstyles, okay? And then widows, of course, come up in James. Take care of the widows and the orphans. But I put alongside of it the same image, that is the same bust, and this one illustrates so well. What, is this plaited hair? I don't know if this is plaited hair or not, but anyway, this is a fine, wealthy person's hair treatment. Here, slave, we have not only rich and poor, we have masters and slaves in James. And so here, a Greek woman and slave. Almost looks like a laptop that she's opening, but we're assuming this is not the case.
Probably a writing, one of the wood writing books you can open.
Oh, yes.
And then, of course, slaves serving, minimal dress, I think I heard you say at one point.
Yeah, the amount of clothing in some ways marks the level that you hold in society. So the servants and slaves would be dressed minimally, and that represented their role.
Right. Daily life, so we have a marketplace here, people selling. I don't know the societal structures that well in Roman times. I can talk about Iron Age, but so I don't know much about the middle class. There certainly has to be a developing middle class, and maybe that would be reflected in these with merchants and so on, and vendors. This would be a place where pretty much everybody goes, open to the public. They are public bath complexes. And then one of my favorite, a fresco of probably well-to-do Romans, a Roman couple, young, of course. And then a family funerary relief, cloaks, togas here that we
Beautifully
have.
draped.
Beautifully draped. Yeah. Here for a girl, and then on the other side, on the right side, men. Now we have a woman on the left and a man on the right. These flowing garments, one can see why you'd need something to hold them. And then hairstyles, probably again among the wealthy.
Described by James.
Yes, we
as to
do.
what to avoid and
That's
what
right.
to include.
You can imagine the hours it would take to produce a hairstyle like that.
Right. And then some garments in general. Now, I want to get to inscriptions. A couple of things here. First of all, inscriptions, we have, 5,000 plus Greek manuscripts of books of the New Testament, and scores of them for James. And these three, which date probably 3rd and 4th centuries, are of the book of James.
Obviously, people appreciated it in the early church and copied them and shared them around.
Right. And then this slide with an ossuary. And we may end at this slide because there's really something important here to talk about.
We talked about this ossuary here.
We did. And so, Kent, I don't know, I don't think you were a student at the University of Toronto when this came.
I was.
Well, you were a student at the
when
time.
I was at the Royal Ontario Museum.
And you were in Wycliffe, were you in Wycliffe College?
I was.
And so this was in the Royal Ontario Museum, the ROM.
Affiliated with the University of Toronto campus.
Correct. So, okay, what is this thing? And what's the big debate? I mean, why did this generate, global debate?
After the families would collect the bones and put them in the box, they would want to remember who's in which box, so they'd often scratch in. It's never nicely done like the original decorations on many of these boxes, but they would scratch in the name. And here we have Yaakov, Jacob, Bar, so this is Aramaic, son of Joseph. So Jacob, son of Joseph. Well, Jacob, the brother of Jesus, was the son of Joseph, right? And that's not too controversial, but what follows it is rather stunning. We have the word for brother.
Is it achu? Is that what we have?
Yeah, probably resumptive pronoun on the end. A brother of him that is Yeshua, which is, of course, the Aramaic for Jesus. So the question is, wow, is this really referring to Jacob and, James, as we remember him, and Jesus? Maybe the latter name was forged or added later. It's possible.
Now, did anybody get into trouble over this ossuary?
Well, there was certainly a big investigation, and the outcome was inconclusive as to whether there was no legal proof, definitive legal proof that it had been forged, but most people cast strong doubt on the authenticity of the brother of Jesus element in this list.
Oded Golan, was that his name?
Yeah.
Who was a collector and did have in his shop equipment at least capable of doing these kinds of things. I'm not putting the blame just on him, but there's a whole market that looks for this kind of thing. So you're going to go with genuine or non-genuine?
I would put strong question on the latter part. I can't prove either way, but sure, we have James, the son of Joseph. It's probably authentic.
Probably authentic ossuary, and maybe the beginning of the inscription.
Okay. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Kent. Thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We look forward to next time, and until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring.